Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and understanding these relationships. So in this video, we're going to grapple with the question of what's the difference between a vulnerable narcissist and a chronic complainer. I'll tell you, to the naked eye, it's very difficult to see. So vulnerable narcissistic folks, here's one thing we know about vulnerable narcissists. They complain a lot. They complain that their life isn't fair to them. They complain that things don't go their way. They complain that things are hard. They complain that they feel like people don't support them enough. They complain that they think other people have it easier than them. They complain and they feel that things are harder for them than for anybody else. The nature of vulnerable narcissism, with its underbelly of anxiety and negative emotions, but all the same other stuff as all narcissism, entitlement and grandiosity and arrogance and validation and admiration seeking and low empathy and selfishness. So for the vulnerable narcissist, instead of coming out as charming and charismatic know-it-alls, they come off as sullen, petulant, victimized know-it-alls. Vulnerable narcissistic folks pull for far more pity than grandiose and malignant narcissists, because despite the exhausting complaining, it does feel like nothing really goes their way, and then they use that as an excuse for not even trying. So the question then becomes, where do we draw a line between someone being a complainer and someone being a vulnerable narcissist? Many of us have chronic complainers in our lives. They're sort of the Goldilocks of the world, right? Too hard, too soft, too cold, too spicy, not this enough, not that enough. Sometimes the complainer sort of feels like a sullen adolescent. The person's like, whatever. You might be in the most beautiful place or even just a nice, pretty place, and they may just look around and do a sort of like, whatever. I guess you wouldn't say that that's active complaining. It's kind of this aggrieved, apathetic passivity. We all have or know complainers in our lives. They are the people where it's a bit exhausting to spend time with them, where you never want to be the one to make the restaurant recommendation because they will chronically complain about it. It's too expensive. I don't like this food. I don't like that food. But they won't make a recommendation themselves. They often feel nothing is right. I know damn well we all have at least one friend or a family member or a co-worker like this. Everything is a cloudy day for complainers, and they vocalize it constantly. And chronic complainers are by and large very negativistic folks. But are they always vulnerable narcissists? No. Once again, and I'm doing this in more than a few videos recently, it relates to how quickly people use the word narcissistic when it doesn't apply. A good rule to remember is that all vulnerable narcissistic people complain, but not all complainers by a long shot are narcissistic. Some complainers, for example, may not be entitled. They may have some empathy, but frankly, if you are complaining all the time or dissing what a person did for you, that seems like a lack of empathy. So I do think that the low empathy and the malcontentedness that goes along with being a complainer means that these two characteristics often co-locate. The complainer may not need admiration or validation. They may just need to complain. The complainer is, however, often someone who has this chronic sense of victimhood. I guess otherwise they wouldn't be complaining, right? Is a complainer selfish by nature? It's a tough call. The complainer probably wants their complaints to be heard, or at least they want to make them. And they often do complain because they want something to go their way. So there's a bit of selfishness to the chronic complainer. It also casts a pall and a cloud over everyone around them. And that sort of feels selfish, to sort of make everyone's day feel as miserable as yours. So I do agree that there is a blurry sort of boundary between vulnerable narcissism and complaining, with almost all vulnerable narcissistic folks prone to complaining. And yet, We want to be careful that we do not use the hammer of narcissism to describe everyone who complains. In general, complainers are chronic malcontents. Nothing is ever enough. And while that has narcissism vibes, it is a little different. When I was thinking about this video, because it had come to me via a different kind of a question, I stopped to think about the Hall of Fame complainers that I know. One of them is a family member, and in their case, they're not a narcissist. They're just a person with a very, very small life and lives in a small world and who has sort of burned most of her bridges, so people just sort of smile politely in a duty-bound way and let her complain. Again, not really narcissistic, just a sad product of the culture she was from. I remember a colleague from way back who was a chronic complainer. In her case, I think there were other mental health issues present. I'm not so sure about narcissism. She was very smart. She was underemployed. So I think the complaining kind of helped her feel alive. I have had friends who were chronic complainers, whom I kind of slowly distanced from. Some were narcissistic. Others were just unhappy at how their lives had turned out. And that right there is a key nugget of complainerhood. They're simply not happy at how their lives turned out, whether that was their careers, whether that was around love or money, families that they wanted to have, or families they wish they didn't have, or how their marriages turned out, or marriages they never had. The complaining becomes their key way of interacting with the world. It's a sort of projection of their internalized disappointment and perhaps their lack of control. One place where complainerhood, if you will, and vulnerable narcissism really overlap is that whole failure to launch piece. There is a stuckness, a lack of agency and efficacy. They don't do, rather they just complain. They talk about the big thing that they want to do, but then talk about the 1,000 barriers ahead of it. They want to write the book and then talk nonsense about their process, and never does a single word get on the page. They want to open a business and talk about the many barriers, but never take a small chance and do a small sort of proof of concept test of their business idea. They talk about their dreams, but they don't take one step towards them. And that is a major overlap between the complainers and the vulnerable narcissistic folks. But they are not the same thing. The tricky bit with understanding narcissism is that it is the full stew. It's not just the carrots. And it can get confusing when you are chronically experiencing one pattern and are wondering what this is. Keep this in mind. If someone is just a complainer without the narcissism, there is some hope for change. It's not a comfortable relationship or friendship, but they may be able to hear it when someone says that they're pushing people away with all of their complaining. And that may propel them to get therapy or some kind of intervention. The complainer who's not narcissistic may take responsibility, and their complaining may also be part of a larger landscape of depression, social anxiety, or some other mental health issue. And as that mental health issue gets addressed, some of that complaining may also lift. If the complaining is embedded as part of a larger, vulnerable narcissistic structure, even if other stuff is addressed in therapy, which they may or may not even go to therapy, the complaining tends not to budge. But you have to be willing, as we know, to first step into the tiger's cage and let the complainer know of your struggles with their complaining. A non-narcissistic complainer may not be thrilled, but also won't have the rage fest that a narcissistic complainer would bring to bear. These overlaps and nuanced differences often come down to whether these are patterns that are in a person that does not have a maladaptive and rigid personality or not. The toxic patterns that are not in a toxic personality, there's a window of hope for change with them. Not so much if it's part of a larger antagonistic personality structure. And the attempts to address it with a person with something like a narcissistic personality will be met with far more rage, like I said, if a person's narcissistic, than if they are just a garden variety complainer. And I shed light on concepts like this and many others in my new book. Very exciting, new book coming out February, available for pre-order now. Click the link in the video description to check it out. Thanks again.